All right. So, in part two of today's show, I want to get into a more specific conversation about USC and just kind of an overview of USC. For those of you who are not familiar with how the show is, this is not a Notre Dame versus USC comparison at the beginning. It's going to be more just about who USC is, what they're good at, what the concerns are. And then I will talk a little bit about after that about the matchup specifically, since I won't be able to do that again until really Friday. So when you start off with USC as a team, as you guys know, this is a 6-5 football team. USC this season has had a very interesting year. Season started off pretty well, actually. The Trojans began the season in the top 20. Started the season off with a very good win over LSU out in Las Vegas. And a back and forth game. It was a good game for 3 quarters, and then the fourth quarter is kind of like neither team wanted to win. Went out the next week, beat Utah State by 48, and then had a tough road loss at Michigan, where I believe Michigan scored a touchdown on the final 10 seconds of the game. Next week against Wisconsin, they were down 21-10 and rallied back and won that game 38-21. Lost on the road the next week to Minnesota. That began a stretch of 3 straight losses for USC. Lost to Minnesota by 10 in a game where Minnesota scored a touchdown in the final 2 minutes. Then they lost in overtime at home to Penn State, 33-30. Lost in the final minute at Maryland, 29-28. And then on a short week, they went out and on a Friday night beat Rutgers, 42-20. Then traveled out to Washington and lost at Washington, 26-21. Then USC had a bye week. And during that time, I think they regrouped a little bit. They made some personnel changes, especially at quarterback. And coming out of the bye week, they've played better football. Beat Nebraska at home the first weekend on the 16th in a 28-20 game, hard-fought game between both teams. USC got the job done and earned a win that got them to 5-5 because they had a losing record going into that game. And then this past week, they obviously had a rivalry game against UCLA, who was playing pretty good football as well coming into that game, at least better than what they had been earlier in the season. They were coming off of a tough road loss to Washington, but they had won 3 out of 4 games. And if you look at their last 5 games before playing USC, they had been competitive in every game. The Washington game was competitive to a degree. Beat Iowa 2017, beat Nebraska at Nebraska, beat Rutgers at Rutgers, and then lost to Minnesota by 4 points. Their loss to Penn State was only by 16 points, and that was a game that was a hard-fought battle. But UCLA had won 3 out of 4, and they were able to get the job done. The game against Nebraska was a very competitive back-and-forth game. Nebraska scored first. USC tied it. Then USC went up 14-7. Nebraska tied it in the second quarter, so it was 14-14 at halftime. Nebraska took a 17-14 lead. USC went right down the field in a little over 2 minutes, scored a touchdown. Long pass from Jaden Maeva to Deuce Robinson to go up 21-17. Nebraska kicked the field goal to make it 21-20. USC put a long 7+ minute drive together late in the game and put the game away 28-20. That drive showed me something about this USC team, that they are, there's been a lot of issues with USC in the past about being a soft football team. That drive showed me that this is not that type of team. Nebraska went out, put a drive together. USC was able to kind of buckle down and force an interception. It was deep in USC territory. Nebraska converted a 4th and 3 on that drive. They converted a 3rd and 10 on that drive to get into scoring range, but then USC ended it with an interception. USC also had a missed field goal in the game. They had a fumble in the game. So they had chances to kind of make that game a little bit more of a convincing blowout, had an early interception in that game. But we're still able to get it done. And then this past weekend, went out and played USC in a really hard-fought game and earned a victory. This is not your typical USC football team in that they're a really soft team. They're not that. They're not like an incredibly physical team either, but they're just not that soft, finesse team they've been in the past. And they're playing better football. I mean, that's really what it boils down to. They're playing better football these last few weeks. Looking at them statistically, offensively, they rank 56 in the nation in scoring offense. Part of that is you want to look like they've got some weird statistics. They rank 33rd nationally in yards per game. They rank 34th nationally in yards per play, which are good numbers. They're 27th nationally in third down offense. They're 35th nationally in red zone offense. those statistics should all come together to make you say they should be a top 30-ish type of scoring offense. I mean, again, top 35 in yards per game, top 35 in yards per play, top 35 in red zone offense, top 35 in third down offense. Those are all good statistics. Those are all things that tell you, hey, this is a good offensive football team. So then you ask yourself, well, then why aren't they better? Right? They're 41st in red zone touchdown offense, which is not great, but still good. But 56th in scoring offense. Why is that? Well, it's because they turn the ball over a lot. And they've turned the ball over 16 in the season 16 times in 11 games, which ranks 77th nationally in lost turnovers. And so that's really been a big part of the issue for USC is just their inability to their inability to protect the football. Now, they turned it over twice against Nebraska and made that game a little bit closer. They didn't turn the ball over at all against UCLA. And I think that was an important piece. If you look at the games that they've won this year, they didn't turn it over at all against LSU. They only turned it over once against Utah State. They turned it over 3 times against Wisconsin, which is why they fell behind 21-10. They only turned it over once against Penn State, forced 3 turnovers, which played a big role in that game being competitive. No turnovers lost against Rutgers. They had 2 against Nebraska, which, again, kept that game a little bit closer, and then no turnovers against UCLA. When they don't turn the ball over, this is a good football team. This is a team that can go beat people. You want to know why they lost to Minnesota? They lost 3 turnovers, only forced 1. I mean, that's the reality of it, is this team cannot afford to turn the ball over, and they've turned the ball over too much, which is why you look at it and say, hey, points per game doesn't match some of those other statistics. And that's kind of where they are. I want to respond to something that Drew Bain just said. Is it a requirement for y'all to speak nicely of our opponents? We shut down Caleb Williams. This won't be close. That's the same crap that people said about Clemson last year. Well, Notre Dame blew Clemson out last year, and this was a better Clemson team. That you beat that team 35-14. What you did last year means nothing. So should we have assumed that Notre Dame was going to lose to Stanford in 2023 because Stanford beat them the year before? Is that how we're going to roll? Because of, well, they did this last year, so we should assume that it's just going to repeat this year? That's not how it works. That's not how when you speak rationally, that's not how football works. Right? Because a lot of stuff that some of y'all are saying now is the same stuff that we heard last year about Clemson. It's the same stuff we heard about. I mean, should we have assumed that Notre Dame was going to get smacked by Louisville early in the year because they lost to Louisville last year? That's not how football works, man. So you don't have to say anything nice about USC. I just think if you want to be someone who's knowledgeable about your opponent, you should be able to say, hey, this is what this team does well. It's okay to say that you think Notre Dame's going to beat USC really convincingly. I'm good with that. Notre Dame if Notre Dame keeps playing the way that they have in recent games, they'll win this game by double digits. I have no doubt about that. But it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be easy. So that's just not how football works. And having an unhealthy view of an opponent doesn't really help with good conversation. That's really what it's about. And so that's what we're getting into. So let's look at the USC defense. What's funny is the USC defense is kind of the opposite of what their offense is they rank 32nd in points per game, but they rank 65th in total yards allowed and 78th in yards allowed per play. Their rush defense is not giving up as many yards. They rank 43rd there, but they're 73rd in yards allowed per rush. And their rushing is really unique because they rank low in rushing yards per game, but they rank really high in yards per carry on offense. On defense, they have a decent top 50 ranking in rushing yards allowed, but they rank 73rd in yards allowed per rush. Passing defense, they rank 93rd overall, but they rank 53rd in yards per attempt and 15th in yards per completion. They don't give up a lot of big plays. They have a very good third down defense. They rank 18th nationally in third down defense, and their red zone defense ranks 74th, which is there's some very contradictory statistics for USC. Very, very contradictory statistics for USC. And, they're a very interesting team. Very interesting team. Salty, you say we're fans and not particularly rational ones, but again, this is Irish Breakdown, man. This is what we do. We actually talk. This isn't a homer site. This isn't everybody sucks and Notre Dame is awesome site. We talk football. We talk reality. We talk rationality. You can be excited about this team. You should be excited about this team. You should think that this team has a chance to go out there and smack USC this weekend. And they do have a chance to smack USC this weekend. And that doesn't mean we can't also appreciate what USC is doing or what USC is or what Army is or whoever else, because then you have I think you can enjoy it more when this team plays well. When Notre Dame plays really well, like if you have an appreciation for why USC has been so competitive this season, then what I think that does is if they go out there and smack USC, then it's going to make you appreciate it more. That's where I'm coming from. I don't think it's unreasonable to expect people to have a rational conversation about Notre Dame or the Notre Dame's opponents. So that's kind of where I'm from. So that's kind of where USC is on the season so far. As you guys can see, they're not really dominant anywhere. They're not really bad anywhere outside of like a stat here, a stat there. Notre Dame has a couple of those as well. And I think that's kind of where this team it's really why they're 6-5, right? Because they've won a lot of games that, they beat LSU's a quality win. Wisconsin's an okay win. Beating Rutgers is a solid win. Beating Nebraska is a good win. I mean, a week later, Nebraska goes out to Wisconsin and just smacks Wisconsin. Or actually, did they play Wisconsin at home? They play Wisconsin home and just absolutely smacked Wisconsin. And now Nebraska's bowl eligible, which is obviously huge for that program. But they just have enough holes that you look at and say, man, they could be better. They should be better. How much better? I think that's debatable. They have a better roster than 6-5, but is it like they should be 10-2 or 10-1, or do they more have an 8-3 type of roster? When I look at USC, I look at this team as look, they're 6-5, right? They should have beat Maryland. Just that was a bad loss. Should have beat Maryland. They should have beat one of Minnesota and Wisconsin, or Minnesota and Michigan. Like they should have beat one of those teams. Like the way they lost late to both of those teams, you got to win one of them. Like based on their talent. The Michigan game was just choking that game away, letting them convert 2 4th downs. They should have won that game. Minnesota was a little bit more competitive. Minnesota, I thought in a lot of ways actually outplayed USC. In a lot of ways where I didn't necessarily feel that way about Michigan as much. I felt USC kind of outplayed Michigan. They had some turnovers that proved very costly. When I look at USC and you say, what kind of team are they really? I look at this team and I think that they're more of an 8-3 type of team than a 6-5 type of team roster-wise. They've obviously made the change at quarterback, bringing in Jaden Maeva. He was a starter last year at UNLV. He was part of getting that UNLV team kind of starting to get the turnaround a little bit. Threw for over 3,000 yards last season and 17 touchdowns. Rushed for 277 yards and 3 touchdowns. Coming off of a game against UCLA where, he had a pretty good day passing. Made a lot of plays with his legs as well, which I don't think he's a super, super dynamic athlete, but he's a good athlete. But he was definitely a problem for UCLA. Passed for 221 yards in the game, had -9 yards overall because of some sacks, and he had one really long loss where he kind of ran all around and lost a lot of yards, but it's not really indicative of the way that I thought he played in the game. And then he was threw for 259 yards, completed over 70% of his passes, and threw 3 touchdowns against Nebraska and rushed for a touchdown. So, different type of quarterback than what they had under Miller Moss. I don't know I don't know that we've seen enough of them to say that they're better with him in the lineup. I think they've been better in the last 2 weeks, maybe. But I think that USC still has some holes, which is why they're 6-5 and why their last 2 games, although wins, were kind of close, hard fought, need to pull it out in the fourth quarter type of wins. But this is also a team, as they showed against Penn State, when they come out and they play well, and they played well against Penn State, they played well against LSU, that they are a football team that is to be reckoned with. We have a different opinion of LSU right now if they beat USC. I mean, they'd be struggling, but they'd be kind of where South Carolina is, where Missouri is right now in the rankings. They wouldn't be out. We'd look at that 3-game stretch of losses and be like, it's tough losses. But before those losses, they'd have been a top 5 to 6 team if they didn't have that loss to LSU. And so then when you lose to A&M and Bama and Florida, you're probably still ranked right now. I'm not saying they should be, but they probably would have been if they had that win. And USC earned that win. And so when they play well, they're a good football team. So when I look at who USC is, I see a team that is more like a team that is they're closer to Georgia Tech than they are Virginia. Right? Is that fair? I mean, Virginia's 5-6, USC's 5-5, Georgia Tech's 7-4. So like record-wise, they're right in between those two teams. But if you were to ask me what kind of results they have, what kind of roster they have, what kind of coaching they have, to me, they're more in line with a Georgia Tech type of team than they are a Virginia type of team. More athletes, better line play, better coaching, just better overall quarterback play. And when I talk about Georgia Tech, I'm talking about Georgia Tech when they're right, not necessarily the team that Notre Dame played without their starting quarterback, but more of just who Georgia Tech is overall. And we've seen that team will have some bad losses to, like we saw as against Virginia Tech, but also some good wins. So different style and different things, but as far as just the quality of the team, they're more on the same level as a Georgia Tech than they are with a Virginia. And that's why I think this is a game where Notre Dame needs to play a little bit better than they did against some of these other teams if they're going to have a similar result. And we certainly see that. So let's dive a little bit specifically into the offense and defense here next. But before we do, folks, do me a favor, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, share this podcast, give us a 5-star review. And if you've not done so, do me a favor, go ahead and sign up for the message boards at boards.oursbreakdown.com.